Hi everyone, my name is Matt Edwards and
I'm Angela Buchert.
we run a company called Expedition Engineering. We're based out of Ucluelet in British Columbia, but all of our trips are overseas. We're going to do a video today about dehydrating food because a lot of our trips we either can't buy the food on location or we can't buy the type of food that some of our guests want. So we've started dehydrating food. So we're just going to go through what that looks like, give you some tips, and we'll actually show you the finished product. And hopefully you learn something from it. And just on that note, all you sea kayak guides out there, how many of you feel like you spend way too much time chopping vegetables and cooking food for clients? Like it's just sort of ridiculous, or can be ridiculous depending on what you're cooking. This is awesome. You basically just chuck some water in a pot, let her go, and it's ready. 20, 30 minutes later, and you've had to do no chopping, and your prep time has been cut down considerably. It's pretty bloody good. It's super skookum.
All right, so just a quick overview of the process of dehydration. So you cook food, you put it in basically heat and airflow, and over 8 to 16 hours, that takes all the moisture out of the food and kind of shrinks it, compacts it, and allowing you to pack it. So one of the advantages of dehydrating is that a normal meal, which is quite large, or all your fruits and vegetables, now a meal for like 6 to 8 people is packed quite small. And then once you're in the field, there's a couple different ways of rehydrating that food. One, if you're in a cold climate, works pretty well, is you put that food in a pot or some kind of a sealable container, water just to cover it, and just let it sit all day in that water, and it slowly rehydrates. In the evening, when you get to camp, you boil it for probably 5 to 10 minutes just to heat it up, and then you can eat it. The other method, if you're in somewhere in a warm climate where you don't want it sitting in food all day, or if you're ski touring and you're not going to be carrying a whole bunch of water, that kind of defeats the whole purpose, is when you get to camp at night, you stick it in a pot in water and basically boil it and then simmer it for probably up to 20 minutes, half an hour, and that will rehydrate it. And then you've got your meal for the evening.
Okay, guys, so I think a common misconception is that dehydrated food doesn't really taste as good as normal or fresh food. And we're here to tell you that is not true. Through trial and error and sort of using a bunch of different companies that provide dehydrated food and making our own dehydrated food, we've found that there's some really good recipes out there, and you can make some fairly comparably good quality food through a dehydrator. So Angela here is going to talk you through that a little bit.
So the first thing is there's a couple different ways that you can dehydrate your meals. One is to take all the separate ingredients and dehydrate each of those ingredients separately. So peas, do the peas in a session, and then next do the tomatoes in a session, next do the spaghetti sauce in a session. And when we started dehydrating, that's the way we did it. And the advantage of that way is that you have lots of options in the field. You can just take the peas, take the tomatoes, take the chicken, and kind of create whatever you want. The disadvantage we found of that is that it takes quite a bit longer in the prep at home because you're doing everything separate like that. The other way that you can do it is basically make a one-pot meal at home and take that whole pot and fill your dehydrator with that meal, and then voila, you have a ready-made meal. The advantage of that is that in the field, all you do is it's super simple. There's like almost no time that your dinner takes in the field. You stick it in a pot and rehydrate it. And it's also less time consuming at home. I'm gonna show you guys the one pot wonder method, which we have grown to prefer over the years. All right, so I'm gonna chat with you guys about some of the equipment that is nice to have. So the first thing is it's good to have a book on dehydrating. It Gives you a lot of information on the different foods, different ideas, and how-tos and mistakes other people have made so you don't make that. This is a great one. It's called The Complete Trail Food Cookbook. I found it quite useful over the years. And the next thing is a dehydrator, which is nice to have, but surprisingly not necessary. And I'll talk about a couple of the options. So when you're buying a dehydrator, there's a few things that you want to look for. And then two really important things is that in the back here is a built-in fan and a heater. And those are basically the two elements to dehydrate food, heat and airflow. You can see on the top of this one, if Matt zooms in up here, this one is Excalibur, and it's probably the top end dehydrator for home use. And you can see it gives you the different temperatures, temperature setting, and a time setting, which I find very useful because I'm very forgetful. And then if I open the lid here, you can see that there's a whole bunch of trays. And I think it's essential to have these two different tray options. This one is for dehydrating like fruit leather or pasta sauces, and this would be for items that aren't very liquidy. So most times when I'm dehydrating one pot wonder, I'm going to use these trays because it's going to be a little bit runny. And so that's the basics of the dehydrator. If you don't have a dehydrator and you don't want to invest in one, you can just use an oven. So if Matt cruises over here to the oven, you can turn the oven on to the desired temperature and basically just stick a wooden spoon in the door, which creates airflow. It's not as perfect as a system as a dehydrator, but that also works for any dirtbag kayakers out there, and I know there are some. The next little section I'm going to talk about here is the food and the quantity. So obviously anytime we're kayaking and supplying food for other people, we want to make sure it's nutritious. It has all the proteins and vitamins and minerals that you need, as well as the correct portion. So when I first started dehydrating, the first trip that we went on was a fairly remote trip in East Greenland, and we discovered quite quickly that our portions weren't big enough. So my kind of rule of thumb now is that when I take a recipe and I make it, I times it by 1.5, and that seems to be plenty of food for everyone on the trip, because you're active, sometimes you're in cold climates and you just need extra food to keep you going. So I find 1.5 quantities of recipes is usually adequate. And what I do, anytime I'm preparing a meal, I make sure that I make it for Matt and I first, so that I know that it tastes good, that it has kind of all the elements that you need, and that the portion is appropriate for 2 adults. And then Matt is my judge. Is this good or is this not good? And then I'll either save that recipe and use it or go on to the next one. So the recipe I'm going to use today is a Moroccan vegetarian tangine, and this is now the standard, one of the standard recipes on our trips. And I've provided a link in the bottom to this recipe if you want to try it out or if you want to do your own dehydrating. So if Matt zooms in on the food before us here, to prepare, I usually get everything out on the table. And I chop everything up to start with and then follow through with the recipe. So you can see here, we've got tomatoes, raisins, apricots, chickpeas, onions, tomatoes, diced tomatoes, olive oil, and then a whole bunch of spices that make Moroccan delicious.
Okay, hey crew, Jamie Oliver here. We're just going to talk about meat in particular. So you got to do things a little bit differently when you're incorporating meat into your dehydrated meal plan. And what we found over time is that even if you cut meat up into small chunks, it doesn't really rehydrate that well. So what we've started doing is just using ground meat, ground chicken, ground beef, and that seems to dehydrate really well because it's smaller. And it also rehydrates almost back to what it was originally. Okay, and the reason we sort of started to do this is because we were running trips in the tropics, and we found that the meat we couldn't carry meat for very long because it would just spoil. There's just no way of doing it. So we started dehydrating, and if you do it correctly, you do it thoroughly, you can actually carry meat throughout the whole trip without any problems, okay? You've got to make sure you dehydrate it completely. And the other trick with meat is that you've got to make sure that no air gets to it. So after you finish dehydrating, if you're going to the tropics, you've got to make sure you get all the air out, because if you get down there and that warm, moist air gets to the meat, it can actually spoil it. So a vacuum packer works really well for that.
Okay, so we've chopped everything, basically made the meal, it's in the pot here. And just a note on chopping, when you do chop the vegetables, you just want to make sure everything is pretty fine so that it dehydrates and rehydrates pretty quick. So if you come over and check out the meal here, this is a smaller version than what we would make commercially, but this would be for, you know, Matt and I on a trip. And if you can kind of see the size of everything, like you probably don't want anything much larger than this tomato here. All right, so you can see it's about 1 inch long and pretty thin, and the chickpeas are just fine like this. That's okay, but nothing much bigger. The apricots are in there. I've chopped them pretty fine. Onions are pretty fine. You can actually see a little apricot right there. All right, so the next step for this is putting it on the trays. I have these dehydrating trays because it's going to be a bit liquidy and wet. If you don't have these special trays, because you have to buy these extra. So if you've just bought the generic dehydrator and you don't have those, what you can use is parchment paper instead of the generic trays that it comes with. So at first I used to use wax paper, and it totally sticks to the meal. So you can see here I've written not for dehydrating, so I remember when I grab it from my drawer that I'm using the parchment paper. So with that parchment paper, you just make a strip like this, and I've actually often clipped it with paper clips so that the fan doesn't blow the edges up and prevent the edges from dehydrating. Okay, so back to our parchment paper. So I'm gonna take the food, I'm gonna put a bunch on the tray, spread it out, and I don't want any of the chunks of food to be overlapping. You gotta think, right, there's just a fan and heat blowing over this, and we wanna make that as efficient as possible. All right, okay, stop it. This is basically 2 large portions worth of food on the tray. And again, none of the food is overlapping. I try to make it as flat as possible. And all the liquid is staying within the tray. You also don't want any openings like that, because then when you have to peel it off once it's dehydrated, it's a bit trickier. So you want to make sure that there's no holes or openings like that. All right, so then I take my tray and I slide it into the dehydrator, and I'm only gonna put as many trays in there as there's actually food. If you've only got half the amount of trays, it's nice to do every other slot so that more airflow occurs. I'm gonna put the lid on, whatever lid you have. And then I'm gonna come and do my setting. So if you're just doing vegetables, it's 125 degrees Fahrenheit. For fruit and fruit roll-ups, it's 135. And I'm gonna treat this like a fruit roll-up because it has all that liquid in there. And then I'm gonna set it on for, I'm gonna start with 8 hours. And once 8 hours is up, I'm gonna go in and check it out, and we'll reassess if we need more time. All right, folks, so when you pull out your dehydrated meal, it will look something like this. And if you zoom in close over here, there's a couple key things. So if it is a one-pot wonder, you'll have, right, it would have been pretty liquidy. And when you pull off that, it'll feel like fruit leather. So you want it to be pliable, but you don't want it to be crispy. If it's crispy, that's you've had it in a bit too long, which really isn't a problem. It just means it rehydrates. It'll take longer to rehydrate. So kind of fruit roll-up like quality, and you can split open some of the chickpeas or whatever your largest food item was in there, and it should be fairly dried all the way through. If there's still a moist little center, you'll know that you need it to be in a bit longer. So once you've pulled out that dehydrated food, there's a couple of ways to store it. On the cheap method is in a Ziploc bag. You can fill up your Ziploc bag, and you want to get all of the air out of here as much as possible. And generally what we do is we zip it up, stick a straw in the little end, close it until the straw, and then actually suck the air out. I don't have any straws with me right now, but that is a good way to kind of make sure that there's very little air in that bag. Or like Matt referred to before, you can use a vacuum packer to really suck the air out of that thing. And then once you've finished your creation, you want to keep it in a cool, dry place. So you can do a freezer, that's great. If you don't have freezer space, just keep it in a dark room or a corner of your cupboard. And dehydrated food, if you have it in like a fridge or a freezer, it'll last for for sure a year and a half. And even if it's not in a fridge or a cooler, 8 months for sure. And so it's a great way to preserve food for a long time, and especially for trips. Nice and lightweight. This is a meal with this other tray. This is a meal for 8 people for ski touring. So pretty compact, and a great way to prep your food for trips.
Okay, crew, final wrap up here from the Expedition Engineering crew. If you've watched this video, hopefully you've enjoyed it. And if you could send us an email verifying that you have watched it to matt@expeditionengineering.com. Thanks for watching us, and unfortunately we're not accepting applications for job offers at the moment.
Thanks everyone.
See you. Bye.